What if the most powerful force in a country wasn't the government but a secret society, an organization that could make or break anyone it touched? This isn't fiction. This was the Mafia in early 20th century America. From backroom deals and political corruption to the violent control of entire industries, the Mafia's rise to power reshaped cities, influenced laws, and operated like a shadow government. Today we'll uncover the roots of the American Mafia, tracing its journey from the late 19th century to its reign in the 1950s. Who were the men behind the scenes, and how did they become so powerful? Let's dive into this complex and dangerous underworld. Chapter 1. Sicilian Beginnings, the Seeds of the American Mafia. The American Mafia's roots go back to the rugged, often lawless landscape of 19th century Sicily, where local communities had long distrusted the state and its ability to provide justice. The Mafia, Cosa Nostra, stepped into this void, creating its own structure of power, loyalty, and control. At its core, the Mafia was about protection. Families or cosci provided safety to locals at a price. They handled disputes, exacted revenge, and offered a form of justice, but their services were anything but altruistic. The system ran on extortion and fear, with omerta, the code of silence, as its lifeblood. Many of these early Mafia figures were forced to flee Sicily because of government crackdowns or local feuds. The large wave of Italian immigration to the United States in the late 19th century brought not just families seeking opportunity, but also men who saw America as fertile ground for their criminal enterprise. New Orleans, the first Mafia city in America. New Orleans is where the Mafia first planted its roots in the United States. By the late 19th century, Italian immigrants, particularly Sicilians, had formed tight-knit communities in the bustling port city. The city's docks became the battleground for Mafia control, with two early families, the Matranga and Provenzano clans, vying for dominance. The Mafia's early operations in New Orleans focused on extortion, particularly with the Black Hand technique. This involved sending anonymous letters to wealthy Italian businessmen, threatening violence if they didn't pay protection money. The fear of retribution kept most victims quiet, and the Mafia thrived on these criminal enterprises. However, it was the assassination of Police Chief David Hennessy in 1890 that placed the New Orleans Mafia on the national stage. Hennessy had been investigating Mafia activity and was rumored to have discovered vital information about the growing power of these Italian crime families. On the night of October 15, 1890, Hennessy was ambushed and gunned down, allegedly by Mafia hitmen. His death sparked a massive public outrage, leading to the arrest of dozens of Italian immigrants, many of whom were suspected Mafia members. When the accused were acquitted due to lack of evidence, a mob stormed the jail and lynched 11 men. This event, one of the largest mass lynchings in U.S. history, exposed the Mafia's grip on New Orleans, but also marked a turning point in the Mafia's strategy. Public scrutiny forced them to operate more clandestinely, using bribery and infiltration of local government to ensure that such violence would not be traced back to them in the future. Chapter 2. The Mafia Migrates. New York and Chicago become battlegrounds. While New Orleans was the Mafia's first major base in the U.S., it was New York and Chicago where the Mafia truly took hold and expanded. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a massive influx of Italian immigrants into New York City. Neighborhoods like Little Italy in Manhattan and Brooklyn became key centers for Sicilian immigrants, many of whom were fleeing both economic hardship and the Mafia back in Sicily. Ironically, they found themselves under the same kind of domination in their new homeland. The early New York Mafia, from street gangs to organized crime. In New York, Mafia families began as small street gangs, extorting local businesses and operating protection rackets. Two key families would come to dominate the early years: the Morello family, led by Giuseppe Morello, and the D'Aquila family, led by Salvatore D'Aquila. These early bosses were the forerunners of what would become the infamous Five Families of New York, each of whom would control their own piece of the city's criminal underworld. Morello and D'Aquila were masters of the Black Hand extortion racket, terrorizing their fellow Italian immigrants into paying for protection. However, the early New York Mafia was not a unified entity. The various gangs often fought amongst themselves for control of territory, leading to bloody feuds that sometimes spilled into the streets. The leadership style was one of brute force, and these early mafia dons operated more like warlords than businessmen. One of the key turning points for the mafia in New York came with the rise of Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria, a ruthless Sicilian gangster who rose to prominence in the 1920s. Masseria sought to consolidate power over all the mafia factions in New York, but his heavy-handed approach created many enemies. Among them was Salvatore Maranzano, another powerful Sicilian mafioso who had different ideas about how the mafia should operate. Chapter 3: The Castellammarese War and Lucky Luciano's Rise to Power. The feud between Masseria and Maranzano escalated into a full-scale mafia war known as the Castellammarese War, which lasted from 1930 to 1931. Named after the town of Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily, where Maranzano hailed from. The war was essentially a battle for control of New York's mafia operations. On one side was Joe Masseria, who controlled a large portion of New York's criminal enterprises, and on the other was Maranzano, who sought to dethrone him and establish a more structured mafia organization. The war was brutal, with both sides ordering assassinations and waging a bloody campaign against each other. But the real winner of the war wasn't Masseria or Maranzano. It was a younger mafioso named Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano had been a lieutenant under Masseria, but saw an opportunity to rise to power by playing both sides. He ultimately betrayed Masseria, orchestrating his assassination in 1931. With Masseria out of the way, Maranzano declared himself the boss of all bosses, capo di tutti capi, believing he could now control the entire mafia structure in New York. But his reign was short-lived. Luciano, realizing that Maranzano's dictatorial style would only lead to more conflict, had Maranzano killed just months after Masseria's death. Lucky Luciano's Mafia, a new era of organized crime. After eliminating both Masseria and Maranzano, Luciano restructured the mafia into what is now known as La Cosa Nostra, meaning this thing of ours. Instead of a single boss ruling over everyone, Luciano introduced a commission system. This was essentially a governing body made up of the heads of the most powerful mafia families, designed to mediate disputes, avoid unnecessary bloodshed, and manage the mafia's growing criminal empire. Under Luciano's leadership, the mafia evolved from a loose collection of gangs into a national network of organized crime families. He divided New York's mafia into 5 families, each controlling its own territory but working together under the commission. The 5-family system remains the basic structure of the mafia in New York to this day. Chapter 4: Prohibition and Bootlegging, the Mafia's Golden Era. Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, was a godsend for the mafia. The nationwide ban on the sale and distribution of alcohol created a massive black market for liquor, and the mafia was quick to take control. Bootlegging, or the illegal production and sale of alcohol, became the mafia's most lucrative business. Mafia families smuggled alcohol from Canada, the Caribbean, and other countries into the U.S., distributing it through a vast network of speakeasies, secret bars where alcohol was sold illegally. The mafia also set up their own distilleries, producing moonshine and other illegal liquors. Some of the most infamous mafia bootleggers included Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York. The profits from bootlegging were enormous, allowing the mafia to expand its operations into other criminal enterprises like gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the mafia had become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. Chicago, Al Capone, and the Prohibition era. While New York was the center of mafia activity in the U.S., Chicago had its own infamous mafia figure, Al Capone. Capone's criminal empire was built on bootlegging, and during Prohibition, he controlled much of the illegal alcohol trade in Chicago. His rise to power was marked by brutal violence, including the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, when 7 members of a rival gang were gunned down by Capone's men. Capone used his wealth and influence to bribe politicians and law enforcement officials, ensuring that his bootlegging operations could continue without interference. By the time Prohibition ended, Capone was one of the most powerful men in Chicago, though his reign would eventually come to an end when he was convicted of tax evasion in 1931. Las Vegas, the Mafia's expansion into gambling. The end of Prohibition forced the Mafia to diversify its criminal enterprises, and one of the most profitable ventures they pursued was gambling. Las Vegas, Nevada became the Mafia's playground. Mafia figures like Bugsy Siegel saw the potential in building luxurious casinos in the desert, and by the 1940s, the Mafia had established a stronghold in the city. Casinos provided the Mafia with a legitimate front for their illegal activities. They used the casinos to launder money from drug trafficking, extortion, and other criminal enterprises, and the profits from gambling helped finance the Mafia's operations across the country. Las Vegas would become synonymous with Mafia control in the 1950s and 1960s, though the mob's influence in the city would eventually wane as federal law enforcement cracked down on organized crime. Chapter 5. The 1950s, the Mafia's peak and the coming storm. By the 1950s, the Mafia had become deeply entrenched in American society. Their control over unions, businesses, and entire industries was well known, but for the most part they operated in the shadows. That changed with the Kefauver hearings in 1950-51. Led by Senator Estes Kefauver, the hearings sought to expose the extent of organized crime in America. For the first time, the American public got a glimpse into the secretive world of the Mafia. Witnesses testified about the Mafia's involvement in everything from drug trafficking to labor racketeering, and the hearings shined a light on the Mafia's influence over politicians and law enforcement. While the hearings didn't result in immediate action against the Mafia, they marked the beginning of a decades-long war between law enforcement and organized crime. The Mafia's expansion into labor unions. One of the key areas where the Mafia exerted influence in the 1950s was through labor unions. By controlling unions like the Teamsters, the Mafia had a stranglehold on industries like trucking, construction, and shipping. They used their control over unions to extort businesses, rig contracts, and embezzle millions of dollars. One of the most infamous Mafia union connections was between Jimmy Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters, and various Mafia families. Hoffa used the Teamsters' pension fund to finance Mafia-controlled businesses, including casinos in Las Vegas. In exchange, the Mafia provided muscle for Hoffa, helping him maintain control of the union and intimidate rivals. Hoffa's ties to the Mafia would eventually lead to his downfall and mysterious disappearance in 1975. Conclusion: the Mafia's lasting legacy. From its humble beginnings in the immigrant neighborhoods of New York and New Orleans, the American Mafia grew into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. By the 1950s, they had a hand in nearly every major industry in America, from construction and gambling to drugs and politics. Their influence was felt in every major city, and their code of silence, omerta, made them nearly untouchable by law enforcement. But the Mafia's power would not last forever. The 1960s and 1970s saw the beginning of the Mafia's decline, as law enforcement cracked down on organized crime and Mafia leaders were brought to justice. Yet, even as Mafia's power waned, their legacy lived on in popular culture and in the shadowy corners of American history. The story of the American Mafia is one of ambition, violence, and survival. A tale of how a group of immigrants built an empire from the shadows, only to see it crumble in the light of day. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more captivating stories from the past. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep exploring the crossroads of history.